The grand living room at Graceland was usually a symphony of laughter, music, and the constant hum of activity. But on this particular Tuesday evening in the late 1960s, it was quiet save for the soft rustle of newspaper pages. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, sat ensconced in his favorite armchair, a cup of lukewarm coffee beside him, his gaze fixed not on fan mail or movie scripts, but on the obituary section of the Memphis Commercial Appeal. He wasn't looking for news of fellow celebrities or the prominent figures of the city. His eyes scanned the smaller, less noticeable entries, the ones that spoke of ordinary lives quietly concluded. His finger traced a line down the page, past names he didn't know, until it stopped on a small, unassuming notice. Martha Mae Higgins, 78, of Binghamton, passed away peacefully at home on Monday, preceded in death by her beloved husband, George. Survived by no immediate family. No immediate family. The words hung in the air, heavy and sad. Elvis pictured an elderly woman, perhaps living alone, for years after her husband passed her world, shrinking until only she remained. He imagined her final days, maybe a kind neighbor checking in, but ultimately the quiet departure. His mind drifted to the practicalities. Who would arrange her funeral? Who would pay for it? The city had provisions for indigent burials, stark affairs in unmarked graves, devoid of dignity. The thought gnawed at him. Martha Mae Higgins, a woman who had lived for nearly 8 decades, deserved more than that. She deserved a proper goodbye, a final gesture of respect even if no family remained to offer it. He sighed, a deep, almost imperceptible sound that only his closest confidants might have noticed. This wasn't the first time an obituary had snagged his attention, pulling him away from the glamorous whirlwind of his life. He often felt the strange quiet kinship with these unseen, unknown souls. They represented a grounded reality, a stark contrast to the often surreal existence he led. Picked up the phone, a heavy cream-colored rotary model, and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was a private line connecting him directly to his trusted assistant, Charlie Hodge, who was probably in another part of the house, perhaps strumming a guitar or reading a book. Elvis's voice was soft, almost a murmur, very different from his powerful stage persona. "Yeah, everything all right?" Charlie's voice was instantly alert, always attuned to the nuances of his boss's mood. "Yeah, just I need you to do something for me. Something quiet." Charlie knew what quiet meant with Elvis. It meant discretion, anonymity, something often involving generosity that Elvis never wanted publicized. "Sure, what is it?" "There's an obituary in today's paper. Martha Mae Higgins says she's 78. No immediate family." Elvis paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want you to find out which funeral home is handling her arrangements, if any, and I want to pay for her funeral, the whole thing. Make sure it's done right, a good casket, and I want it to be completely anonymous. No names, no hints, just a payment from an anonymous benefactor." He was used to Elvis's spontaneous acts of kindness, buying cars for strangers, paying medical bills for staff, tipping excessively, but funerals for complete strangers, this was a newer, deeper vein of his boss's compassion. "No problem. I'll get right on it, first thing in the morning." "You sure about the anonymous part? Most folks would want to be known for something like this." "That's exactly why I don't want to be known, Charlie," Elvis replied, his voice firm but gentle. "It's not about credit. It's about respect. About ensuring that someone, even if they're alone in the world, gets a proper send-off. Imagine living your whole life, then leaving it without anyone to care enough to make sure you're buried with dignity." He paused again, thinking of his own mother Gladys, gone too soon. He remembered the pain of her loss, the desire to give her the best, the most respectful farewell. Perhaps in a way these acts were a quiet homage to her, an extension of the love he still carried. "Just make sure it's handled. And don't tell anyone, not even the Colonel. This is just for us, understand?" "Understood. Your secret's safe with me," Charlie promised, a warmth spreading through him. He often witnessed the flashy side of Elvis, the rock star persona, But it was these quiet, deeply empathetic moments that truly revealed the man beneath the legend. Elvis hung up the phone, the silence of the room returning. He looked down at the newspaper again, at Martha Mae Higgins' name. A quiet peace settled over him. Couldn't bring her back, but he could, in a small, unseen way, ease her final journey. It was a secret act, a private solace, and it felt more real, more meaningful than any cheering crowd or platinum record ever could. He knew this wouldn't be the last time. The quiet impulse had taken root. The following morning, well before most of Memphis stirred, Charlie Hodge was on the phone. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood the delicate nature of his task. A few discreet calls to a known local law firm, then to a couple of funeral homes listed in the Yellow Pages. It didn't take long to locate Martha Mae Higgins. Her arrangements, or lack thereof, were indeed being handled by the dignified, family-run O'Caven Funeral Home. Mr. Arthur Henderson, the proprietor of O'Caven, was a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and an air of quiet professionalism. He answered the phone himself. O'Caven Funeral Home, Arthur Henderson speaking. Mr. Henderson, my name is Charles Hodge. I'm calling on behalf of an anonymous client regarding the arrangements for Martha Mae Higgins. Charlie kept his voice neutral, professional, carefully omitting any hint of his real employer. Mr. Henderson paused. Ah, yes, M.S. Higgins. A rather sad case. Unfortunately, there's no family we've been able to locate. We were preparing to proceed with the city's provisions. His voice held a note of weary resignation. City provisions meant the bare minimum. A respectful but stark burial in a pauper's field. My client wishes to cover all expenses for a full dignified service for M.S. Higgins, Charlie stated simply. Everything. The casket, the embalming, a viewing, a chapel, service, transportation, and a proper plot at a reputable cemetery, whatever you deem appropriate, for a respectful farewell. Mr. Henderson, I beg your pardon, an anonymous client for M.S. Higgins. Yes, sir, my client believes everyone deserves a dignified end, regardless of their circumstances or the presence of family. I will arrange for a wire transfer immediately. Please pardon for wire tran. He'd been in the funeral business for decades, seen it all: grief, anger, desperate poverty, extravagant displays of wealth. But an anonymous donor covering the full cost for a stranger with no family, this was unprecedented. A quiet miracle. Really? I'll draw up the estimate right away and call you back within the hour. Thank you, Mr. Hodge. Please convey my deepest gratitude to your client. This is truly remarkable. Within hours, the transaction was complete. The funds were transferred from a discreet account, carefully masked to prevent any tracing back to Elvis. Charlie later provided Elvis with a brief, clipped report. Martha Mae Higgins, O'Caven Funeral Home. All paid for anonymous. Just like you wanted. Elvis simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He didn't ask for details of the service, didn't want to know. The knowledge that it was handled, that a quiet woman had received a proper send-off, was enough. It was a seed planted unseen, unacknowledged, but deeply felt. Meanwhile, at O'Caven Funeral Home, Arthur Henderson was busy making arrangements. He meticulously upgraded every aspect of M.S. Higgins' farewell. Instead of a simple pine box, a lovely, modest oak casket was selected. The chapel was prepared with care. Fresh flowers ordered, a dignified gravestone chosen for a plot in a well-maintained section of the cemetery. He even managed to track down a distant niece of Martha Mae, a woman named Agnes, who lived in Nashville and hadn't been in touch for years. Agnes arrived, initially hesitant and apologetic, explaining that financial hardship had kept her from visiting, let alone contributing to funeral costs. When Mr. Henderson explained that all expenses had been covered by an anonymous benefactor, Agnes was overwhelmed. But why? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Who would do something like that for Aunt Martha, For us." Mr. Henderson simply shook his head. "We don't know, ma'am. Only that someone cared enough to ensure Miss Higgins received the respect she deserved. It's a true act of kindness." The small service for Martha Mae Higgins was modest, but dignified. Agnes, along with a few of Ms. Higgins' old neighbors, attended. The chapel was filled with a quiet sense of gratitude, a feeling that something profoundly good had occurred. The neighbors murmured about the mystery, about the unexpected dignity bestowed upon a woman they had known to be frugal and unassuming. Agnes, standing by the fresh grave, felt a profound sense of relief and a strange, powerful connection to the unknown benefactor. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the affirmation that her aunt, though seemingly alone, had been valued by someone. It allowed her to grieve properly without the crushing weight of financial burden or the shame of an undignified burial. Back at Graceland, Elvis was preparing for a recording session, the usual flurry of activity surrounding him. But in a quiet corner of his mind, the image of Martha Mae Higgins, dignified and at peace, brought a flicker of light. He knew his acts of charity would be forgotten by the public, eclipsed by his music and his fame, but in these small secret moments, he felt a deeper purpose, a connection to the fundamental humanity that fame often obscured. The seed had been planted. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Elvis found himself drawn back to the newspaper, scanning the obituaries, looking for another quiet soul who deserved a proper farewell. The anonymous payments for strangers. The single act of kindness for Martha Mae Higgins wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first ripple in what would become a quiet, continuous wave of generosity. Over the next few years, Elvis's ritual solidified. Every morning after his coffee, he turned directly to the obituary section. His criteria weren't scientific, but they were deeply personal. Older folks, often described as having no immediate family or residing in modest neighborhoods, or tragically young individuals whose lives were cut short, hinting at families left in sudden, unbearable financial distress. He had a small, discreet network of contacts, a few understanding lawyers, a couple of trust officers at banks, and a handful of local funeral homes he knew could be relied upon for absolute discretion. When Elvis pointed to a name in the paper, Charlie would spring into action. The phone calls made, the wire transfers arranged, always with the same strict instruction. Anonymous, no names, no hints. Elvis rarely spoke about it, not even to Charlie, beyond the initial instruction. It was a private solace, a quiet counterpoint to the roaring demands of his public life. When the world clamored for more records, more movies, more performances, Elvis found a quiet grounding in these unseen acts. It reminded him that beyond the glitz and the screaming fans, there was real life, real sorrow, and the fundamental human need for dignity. One afternoon, Elvis was lounging by the pool, sunglasses on, but his mind far away from the sun. Charlie approached, a folded newspaper in his hand. "Remember that young fella last month? The one who died in that factory accident, left a wife and 3 little kids." Elvis nodded, remembering the entry he'd seen. A 28-year-old, sudden and tragic. They used the money to get a proper stone, too. Something for the kids to remember him by. Elvis removed his sunglasses, his eyes thoughtful. "Good," he said simply. The word wasn't just about the act itself, but about the profound relief it brought him. He hadn't wanted accolades, but knowing that the money had truly helped, that it had eased a heavy burden, was his only reward. Back at Oakhaven Funeral Home, Arthur Henderson had indeed started to notice a pattern. Over the past few years, a surprising number of difficult cases, those with no family, or families clearly struggling financially, had suddenly found their funeral expenses mysteriously covered. Payments always came from the same anonymous source, facilitated by a low-key individual who never gave a name other than Charles Hodge and a generic law firm as a point of contact. It wasn't a huge volume, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, but it was consistent. And it was always for cases that truly tugged at the heartstrings. The elderly widow, the young accident victim, The child lost too soon? Arthur, a man who believed deeply in the inherent goodness of people, couldn't help but wonder, who was this person? What kind of wealth, and more importantly, what kind of heart did they possess to do such a thing without seeking recognition? He thought about the details. Payments were always prompt, no questions asked about cost. They were always generous, covering not just the basics, but ensuring a truly dignified send-off, and they always insisted on absolute anonymity. Arthur was a discreet man by nature, a virtue essential in his profession. He never spoke of the anonymous donor even to his own family, but he kept a quiet mental tally. He noted the addresses of the deceased, the dates of the payments, the vague connection to a lawyer's office in downtown Memphis. He didn't want to expose the benefactor. He simply wanted to understand. It was like observing a rare and beautiful bird, not wanting to disturb it, just appreciating its existence. Considered the types of people who might have that kind of money and that kind of heart in Memphis: a successful businessman, an old money philanthropist. He ran through the possibilities, but none quite fit the consistent, almost quiet desperation of the cases chosen. It wasn't the kind of high-profile, PR-driven charity he sometimes saw. This was different. This felt personal. One evening, after helping a grieving family say goodbye to their daughter, a young girl lost to a sudden illness, Arthur sat in his office, the quiet hum of the building around him. The girl's parents had been beside themselves with grief and worry about how they would afford the funeral. The anonymous payment had come through a silent blessing. He remembered the mother's whispered words. "It's like an angel sent it." Arthur leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. An angel? Yes, that seemed about right. He didn't know who this anonymous donor was, but he knew one thing. Their actions were making a profound difference, alleviating suffering in the most fundamental way, allowing families to grieve without the added burden of financial ruin. And in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, that was a truly precious thing. He resolved to continue his quiet observation, admiring the pattern of grace. Arthur Henderson's curiosity, born not of nosiness, but of profound admiration, continued to deepen. Pattern of anonymous payments for the city's forgotten or financially struggling dead had become undeniably consistent. He had seen the relief on countless faces, the quiet dignity restored to lives that might otherwise have ended in neglect. And each time he silently thanked the unseen hand behind the generosity. He was a man who appreciated details. He noticed that the payments, while originating from different banks or law firms on paper, invariably followed a similar path, often routing through accounts connected to a specific, highly reputable law firm in downtown Memphis, one known for managing the affairs of the city's wealthiest. He also noted the swiftness with which the funds appeared, always within a day or two of Charlie Hodge's initial call. This wasn't someone deliberating over charity. This was someone making quick, decisive actions. Arthur never tried to pry from Charlie Hodge directly. Charlie was a wall of professional discretion, always polite, always firm about the anonymity. But Arthur was a good listener, and he sometimes heard snippets from other funeral directors in town. A hushed rumor here, a confirmed but unexplained payment there for similar difficult cases. It seemed Oak Haven wasn't the only funeral home benefiting from this quiet benevolence. The anonymous benefactor was casting a wider net subtly across the city. One sweltering summer afternoon, a new obituary caught Arthur's eye, one that hit particularly close to home. He braced himself, expecting the call from Charles Hodge. Sure enough, it came within hours. Maria Rodriguez. Charlie's voice, as always, gave nothing away. "My client wishes to cover all expenses, Mr. Henderson." A complete and dignified service. Arthur swallowed a lump forming in his throat. "Understood, Mr. Hodge. We'll ensure she receives the best possible care. Thank your client for me." He felt a renewed surge of respect. This wasn't just about money. It was about a profound empathy for human suffering, a recognition of the value of every life, no matter how humble. couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to understanding. The sheer volume of Elvis Presley's charity work was well known in Memphis. Cars, homes, cash given freely to friends, family, and even strangers encountered on the street. But this was different. This was systematic, focused, and utterly devoid of public recognition. Arthur remembered an article he'd read recently in a national magazine, a profile of Elvis. It spoke of his deep spirituality, his generosity, but also of his profound sense of loneliness amidst the constant adulation. It mentioned his love for his mother Gladys, and how her passing had deeply affected him. A thought, a mere whisper of an idea, began to form in Arthur's mind. Could it be the fame, the wealth, the known generosity, the deep personal connection to loss, his mother, the need for anonymity in a life lived so publicly? It was a crazy idea, almost impossible to believe, but it fit. Who else in Memphis had the resources, the heart, and the burning need for a quiet, meaningful outlet away from the spotlight? He dismissed the thought almost immediately. It was pure speculation, bordering on fantasy. And even if it were true, what would he do with that knowledge? His duty was to the deceased and their families, and to the anonymous benefactor whose privacy was paramount. Meanwhile, at Graceland, Elvis felt the familiar, quiet satisfaction as Charlie gave him the brief update about Maria Rodriguez. It's handled. The family was distraught. They're so grateful. Elvis nodded, his eyes distant. He imagined the little children, motherless now, at least spared the additional burden of a pauper's funeral for their beloved mama. The thought settled in his heart, a small, warm ember in the vast, sometimes cold expanse of his life. The world saw Elvis Presley, the dazzling performer, the symbol of an era. But in the quiet moments, late at night or early in the morning with his newspaper, he was simply a man burdened by immense fame, but finding a profound sense of purpose in the silent act of caring for strangers. Ensuring their last journey was one of grace. The mystery of the benefactor remained, but for Arthur Henderson, the pieces were beginning to align, painting a quiet, improbable picture of the king of rock and roll. Years melted into a decade, and then more. Elvis continued his quiet acts of benevolence, a constant, unseen current flowing beneath the surface of his tumultuous life. He toured, he recorded, he made movies. He navigated personal joys and heartbreak. The ritual of the newspaper, the quiet selection of a name, and Charlie's discreet calls remained a bedrock. The ripple effect of these actions, though unseen by Elvis, spread far and wide, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. Take the case of young Marcus Dixon. In 1969, his father, a hard-working mechanic, had died suddenly of a heart attack at 45. The family had nothing. Marcus, then a shy 12-year-old, remembered his mother's tear-filled eyes, not just from grief, but from the crushing worry of how she would bury her husband, her soulmate. Then came the miracle. The phone call from Oak Haven Funeral Home, saying everything was covered by an anonymous donor. Marcus remembered the lightness that came over his mother, the way she was finally able to truly mourn instead of being consumed by practical despair. She arranged a beautiful, respectful service, a proper burial that allowed them to say goodbye with dignity. Years later, Marcus, now a successful architect in his early 30s, often thought about that time. He didn't know who the donor was, but the act of generosity had left an indelible mark on him. It taught him about profound, selfless kindness. It shaped his own view of the world, instilling in him a desire to give back, to help those in need, even if anonymously. He eventually became a quiet philanthropist himself, sponsoring scholarships for underprivileged youth, a silent echo of the generosity he had once received. Sometimes a direct thank you note filtered through the funeral home, and Charlie would make its way to Elvis. These were rare, brief, often handwritten on crumpled paper, addressed simply to our anonymous benefactor. They spoke of profound gratitude, of burdens lifted, of peace found. One note received shortly after the funeral of an elderly schoolteacher read, "Your kindness allowed us to honor Miss Eleanor as she deserved. She touched so many lives, and now even in death, she reminds us that good nest you. Elvis kept that note. He didn't frame it or display it. It was tucked away in a drawer in his bedside table, a private treasure. He would sometimes pull it out, smoothing the creased paper, reading the simple words. These notes were his true gold records, his most cherished awards. They affirmed the silent purpose he had found. Charlie Hodge, witnessing Elvis's dedication to these acts over the years, felt a deepening respect and loyalty for his boss. He saw the toll the fame took on Elvis, the isolation, the constant demands. But he also saw the quiet joy, the genuine peace that these anonymous donations brought him. Charlie understood that for Elvis, this wasn't about public image or tax write-offs. It was an essential part of who he was, a way to connect with humanity, to give back without expectation. He meticulously maintained the anonymity, knowing how important it was to Elvis. Charlie had developed a sixth sense for reporters, sniffing around for any hint that the story of the Memphis Angel might break. He was always one step ahead, diverting inquiries, ensuring the paper trail led nowhere. Arthur Henderson, at Oak Haven Funeral Home, was now training his son David in the family business. He would occasionally tell David about the guardian angel of Memphis, as he privately thought of the anonymous benefactor. He never named Elvis, but his descriptions grew more detailed, hinting at the scope of the individual's wealth, their reclusive nature, their deep empathy. David, initially skeptical, soon witnessed the pattern himself, receiving the same calls from Charles Hodge, processing the same discreet, generous payments for cases that truly needed them. This person, whoever they are, Dad, David once remarked, they've touched so many lives. It's remarkable. Arthur simply nodded, a knowing glint in his eye. Indeed, son, remarkable. Some of the greatest kindnesses are those performed in secret. He thought of Elvis, perhaps at that very moment, scanning the Memphis commercial appeal, his heart moved by another quiet obituary. He imagined the king burdened by the crown of fame, yet finding profound solace in these silent, selfless acts. The unseen ripple continued, a testament to the quiet grace of a man who understood perhaps better than anyone the value of dignity, even in death. The sheer volume of anonymous generosity flowing into Memphis funeral homes was bound to attract attention. One muggy summer, a persisting young reporter from a national tabloid, new to the city, started sniffing around. She'd heard whispers of a mysterious benefactor, a phantom philanthropist who ensured the poorest and loneliest of Memphis received dignified burials. To her it smelled like a scoop, possibly a public relations stunt by some local magnate. Her inquiries began innocently enough. She called a few funeral homes, including Oak Haven, asking vague questions about unusual donations or anonymous benefactors. Arthur Henderson was immediately on high alert. He fielded the call from the reporter, a sharp young woman named Brenda Jenkins. Mr. Henderson, I'm Brenda Jenkins from the Expositor. I'm working on a piece at a local charity, and I've heard some interesting rumors about generous anonymous donations to cover funeral costs. For those in need, can you confirm any such activity? Miss Jenkins, our business is discreet by nature. We handle the arrangements for all families with equal care and respect. Any financial arrangements made are strictly confidential between us and our clients. He knew his words were technically true, but deliberately evasive. He felt a surge of protectiveness for his unknown benefactor. Brenda persisted. So you're saying there's no anonymous donor, no angel of Memphis, as some are calling them? Her tone was skeptical, hinting at a larger story. I can neither confirm nor deny specific financial arrangements, Arthur replied, his voice firm. Our focus is on providing dignified services. He politely ended the call, his heart thumping a little faster than usual. He immediately called Charlie Hodge's discreet number. Mr. Hodge, "This is Arthur Henderson. Just received a call from a reporter, Brenda Jenkins, from the Expositor asking about anonymous funeral donations. Thought you should know." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Charlie's voice, sharp with concern. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. That's very helpful. We'll handle it. And thank you again for your discretion." Charlie hung up and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Expositor was known for sensationalism, for digging up dirt and twisting facts. If this story broke, if Elvis's quiet acts were exposed, it could ruin everything. Not because Elvis was doing anything wrong, but because the very public nature of his life meant that even genuine kindness could be distorted, made into a PR stunt or worse, used to create a feeding frenzy from others seeking handouts. He went straight to Elvis, who was relaxing in the TV room, watching a movie. "We've got a problem." A reporter's sniffing around about the anonymous payments. Elvis froze, the smile fading from his face. "Who? Where?" Charlie explained about Brenda Jenkins and her inquiries. "She's digging. Arthur Henderson was good, but she's persistent. If she connects the dots, or even just writes a story about a mystery angel, the whole thing could unravel." Elvis closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping him. The thought of his private solace being dragged into the public arena, dissected and speculated upon, was profoundly unsettling. "We can't let that happen, Charlie. It's not about me. It's about the families. If this becomes a circus, it devalues what we're doing. It would draw every con artist in the country here too." He stood up, pacing restlessly. "What can we do? Can we have someone lean on her?" "Politely, of course. I've already got our legal team alerted," Charlie said. "They'll send a cease and desist. Threaten libel if she publishes unsubstantiated rumors. We'll also have a few friendly editors in town. Put a word in, most local papers respect privacy more than the tabloids." For the next few days, the air at Graceland was thick with tension. Elvis was more withdrawn than usual. The potential exposure of his quiet, heartfelt acts felt like a violation. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want praise. He wanted only for these families, these forgotten souls, to receive dignity in their final moments without the glare of his fame. Brenda Jenkins, despite her persistence, eventually hit a wall. Every funeral home she called clammed up. Lawyers sent stern letters. Her editors, swayed by some quiet calls, suggested she pivot to another story. She never got her scoop. The Memphis Angel remained a whisper, a local legend, but never a headline. When Charlie finally told Elvis, the threat had passed. A palpable wave of relief washed over him. He sank back into his armchair, the weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank God," he murmured. "Thank God." He looked out the window at the setting, Memphis sun painting the sky in fiery hues. He reflected on why he did this. It wasn't for fame, certainly not. It was for the silent good, the quiet connection, the profound sense of giving back without expectation. In a life where so much was public, this was his sacred private space, and he would protect it fiercely. The experience only deepened his resolve to continue even more discreetly, knowing that the greatest impact was often made in silence. Decades had passed since the close call with the reporter. Elvis continued his secret mission, though with ever-increasing discretion as his fame grew and his personal life became more tumultuous. The payments continued silent and steadfast, a hidden anchor in the storm of his celebrity. In a quiet corner of Memphis, far from the bustling tourist attractions and Graceland's gates, lived Sarah Jenkins. She was now in her late 40s, a highly respected principal of an elementary school in a low-income neighborhood. She was known for her compassion, her unwavering belief in her students, and her relentless efforts to secure resources for their families, but few knew the true catalyst behind her deep commitment to service. Sarah was only 7 years old when her mother, a single parent, passed away unexpectedly from a sudden illness. Her mother had worked tirelessly as a seamstress, barely making enough to keep them housed and fed. When she died, the family was plunged into not only grief but utter despair. There was no money for a funeral, not even the simplest one. Sarah remembered sitting with her grandmother, listening to the hushed, tearful conversations about city services and burial without a viewing. The shame and heartbreak were almost unbearable. Then, a quiet miracle. The funeral director, Mr. Arthur Henderson of Oakhaven, had called. All expenses were covered, he'd said. An anonymous donor had stepped forward to ensure Sarah's mother received a dignified farewell. Sarah remembered the beautiful, simple wooden casket, the sweet scent of lilies in the small chapel, the sense of peace that washed over her grandmother, allowing them to grieve with grace. That act of unknown kindness had changed the trajectory of Sarah's life. It taught her at a tender age that even in the darkest moments, profound goodness could emerge. It taught her that every life had value deserving of respect even in death. It inspired her to dedicate her own life to helping others, especially children who faced similar hardships. Years later, when Sarah established a small foundation to provide emergency aid to her students' families, covering unexpected medical bills, rent assistance, and, yes, sometimes funeral costs for those who had lost a loved one, she named it the Dignity Fund. It was her silent tribute to the anonymous benefactor who had given her mother dignity in death, and in doing so had given Sarah hope. In life, she often wondered about her own angel. Who was this person who had such quiet empathy? She knew it wasn't local charity groups. Mr. Henderson had been very clear. The thought often gave her comfort, reminding her that quiet acts of grace truly mattered. One day, while researching historical records for a local community project, Sarah stumbled upon old newspaper clippings and obscure archives referencing a series of unexplained benevolent acts in Memphis during the 60s and 70s. The articles were vague, dismissed as local folklore by some, but they described payments for funerals, consistently for the poor or friendless, always anonymous. An old blurry photograph accompanied one of the articles, showing a funeral home with its hearse, and in the background, a very large black custom car, distinctive even in the grainy image. It was the kind of car only a very few people in Memphis could afford or would drive. A fleeting image of Elvis Presley driving around Memphis in his custom cars flashed through her mind. No, it was too wild a thought, too fantastical. Meanwhile, Elvis, unaware of the lives he had quietly shaped, continued his routine. He was older now, the famous sideburns touched with gray, his body carrying the weight of years of touring and the pressure of being Elvis. He had his own health struggles, his own burdens. But the newspaper ritual, the quiet phone call to Charlie, the solemn act of selecting another life to honor, remained. He found solace in it, a quiet strength. It was a reminder that, despite the chaos, the loneliness, and the constant demands of his public persona, he could still make a tangible difference in the lives of complete strangers without ever seeking acknowledgement. It was a way to touch humanity directly, heart to heart, unseen and unheard. One morning he saw an obituary for a beloved elementary school principal, praised for her dedication to the city's children, particularly in its most challenged neighborhoods. The article spoke of her recent illness, the quiet fund she had established, called the Dignity Fund, and her profound belief in the intrinsic value of every human life. Elvis read the words, a flicker of something familiar in the story. He felt a connection, a quiet appreciation for a stranger who lived a life dedicated to kindness, considered covering her funeral, but the article mentioned her colleagues and community had already rallied to cover expenses. A testament to her own impact. He smiled faintly. Good to know that kindness once sown had a way of echoing, growing, and inspiring others. He folded the paper, feeling a quiet satisfaction. His work, his silent offerings were a part of a larger, unseen tapestry of human goodness. The mid-1970s brought a different kind of pressure for Elvis. The concerts were still sellouts, the adoration undimmed, but the grind was relentless. His health was failing. His personal life was a labyrinth of complexities, and the constant scrutiny of the public eye weighed heavily on him. He felt trapped, a gilded bird in a very large, very opulent cage. The joyous energy of his early years was often replaced by a weary resignation. In these challenging times, his quiet ritual of reading the obituaries became less a spontaneous act of empathy and more a necessary anchor, a lifeline to a reality outside the madness of his fame. It was a way to connect with the raw, fundamental truths of life and death, stripped of all celebrity and pretense. He would sit in the solitude of his room at Graceland, or sometimes in the quiet of a hotel suite far from Memphis, the local newspaper. Bread before him. His eyes would scan the names, the dates, the brief narratives of lives lived, and concluded he wasn't looking for sadness anymore. He was looking for purpose, for a quiet way to affirm his own humanity amidst the suffocating demands of being the king. One particularly grueling tour, Elvis was feeling the strain deeply. Exhaustion was a constant companion, and the loneliness was a sharp ache in his chest. In his hotel room, he picked up a newspaper from a town he didn't even remember the name of. An obituary caught his eye. Wally Thompson, 89, decorated Wee veteran, passed away peacefully, survived by no immediate family. A wave of profound sadness washed over Elvis. An old soldier, someone who had served his country, now dying alone. He thought of his own father, Vernon, and the quiet dignity of older men. This Wally Thompson, he deserved a hero's send-off, not a lonely, forgotten burial. He called Charlie, his voice rough with fatigue. "Charlie, there's a veteran, Wallace Thompson, died in..." He looked at the paper. "Omaha, no family. Can we get him a proper burial? Full military honors, if possible." Charlie, ever loyal, ever discreet, sprung into action, navigating the complexities of arranging an anonymous payment for a funeral in a distant city. He knew this wasn't just charity for Elvis, it was a form of self-preservation. It was how Elvis stayed grounded, how he reminded himself that life was about more than limousines. And sold-out arenas, the funds were transferred, the arrangements made. Charlie later reported back to Elvis, Wally Thompson received a full military funeral. Director said it was a powerful service, even if only a few local veterans attended. They were solemnly nodded, his eyes closed. A faint, almost peaceful smile touched his lips. He imagined the old soldier finally at rest, honored as he deserved to be. It brought him a quiet solace, a moment of profound peace in a life increasingly devoid of it. Charlie observed Elvis's unwavering commitment to these acts, even when his own physical and mental health were in decline. He saw Elvis pore over the newspapers, sometimes for an hour before selecting a name. He witnessed the quiet satisfaction that followed each successful arrangement. It was clear this wasn't a phase. It was an integral part of who Elvis was, a deeply ingrained need to perform anonymous acts of grace. The weight of fame was immense. Crushing at times, the expectations, the constant demands, the loss of personal freedom, it all took a toll. But in the quiet hours, as he sought out another forgotten soul, another life to honor, Elvis found a profound sense of purpose that transcended the superficiality of his public image. He was the king, yes, but he was also simply Elvis, a man with a big heart trying to do a little good in the world, one quiet funeral at a time. This was his true secret legacy, far more enduring than any fleeting applause. As the 1970s progressed, Elvis Presley's life became increasingly challenging, a relentless cycle of concerts, medications, and private struggles. Yet, through it all, the quiet ritual of reading the newspaper obituaries and initiating anonymous funeral payments continued an unwavering thread in the complex tapestry of his life. It was a secret known only to his closest confidants, Charlie Hodge, and a very select few of his inner circle. In Memphis, within the tight-knit community of funeral directors, The Memphis Angel had become a legend. It was a story passed down from generation to generation, spoken of in hushed tones of awe and admiration. Arthur Henderson, now in his late 70s, had long since retired from Oak Haven Funeral Home, passing the reins entirely to his son David. But the memories of the mysterious benefactor remained vivid. Arthur would sit on his porch sipping iced tea and sometimes tell David or even his grandchildren about the angel. He never named Elvis, but his descriptions were rich with detail, tinged with a knowing certainty. This person, he'd say, was of immense means, but more importantly, of immense heart. They never sought recognition, never wanted a name in the paper. Their only desire was to give dignity to those who had none, to ease the burden of grief for the most vulnerable. He'd talk about the types of cases: the elderly, the forgotten, the tragically young, the families facing sudden, overwhelming poverty. He'd recall the speed and efficiency of the payments always discreetly handled. It was like clockwork, he'd muse, a quiet, steady stream of grace flowing into our city. David Henderson, who now took the calls from Charles Hodge, had come to believe his father's theory about Elvis. Clues were too compelling, too consistent with the king's known, albeit often publicized, generosity. But like his father, David understood the sanctity of the secret. It wasn't his to reveal. It was a sacred trust. The cumulative impact of Elvis's actions was vast. Hundreds of families in Memphis and beyond had been spared the additional anguish of financial ruin on top of their grief. Hundreds of lives otherwise forgotten had received a respectful, dignified farewell. These quiet acts had allowed people to mourn, properly to find closure and to begin healing without the added weight of debt or shame. For Elvis, as his own health deteriorated, these acts became even more profoundly meaningful. They were his personal form of spiritual expression, a way to connect with something larger than himself, something purer and untainted by the commercialism and pressures of his career. When the crowds cheered, he often felt hollow. When Charlie reported that a family had been helped, a quiet sense of fulfillment would settle over him. One of his last anonymous payments was for a homeless man, a veteran of the Korean War whose obituary was just a few lines in the Memphis paper, found deceased under an overpass. Elvis read it, his eyes clouded with emotion. This man who had fought for his country had ended his life alone on the streets. It resonated deeply with Elvis's own feelings of isolation, despite his fame. "Charlie," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I want him to have the best. A proper burial in a veteran's cemetery. A headstone that says he was a soldier, a human being. Make sure someone reads a eulogy. Even if it's just a funeral director." Charlie, his own eyes a little moist, assured him it would be done. It was one of the last conversations they had about these quiet arrangements. Elvis passed away not long after, in August 1977, leaving behind a grieving world, a legendary musical legacy, and a secret history of quiet grace. The public mourned the king, the icon, the performer. Few, if any, knew the depth of the man who sought out the forgotten and ensured their dignity in death. The flow of anonymous payments for strangers' funerals in Memphis did not immediately cease after Elvis's passing. Charlie Hodge, ever loyal, continued to honor Elvis's unspoken wishes for a short while, using funds that Elvis had set aside for his personal charities. But eventually, the wellspring of this particular form of quiet benevolence began to recede, becoming rarer, and then finally ceasing altogether. The change was noted by funeral directors like David Henderson. They didn't know why, but they felt a quiet sadness, a sense of loss for the unknown guardian angel. The legend, however, lived on, whispered in the hallowed halls of Memphis funeral homes. The story of a silent, compassionate presence who had brought dignity to countless lives, often when no one else would. Years, then decades rolled by after Elvis Presley's passing. Graceland became a shrine, visited by millions. His music continued to inspire his image. Enduring as a cultural icon, the world knew of his lavish gifts to friends and family, his charitable donations to causes. but the story of the anonymous funeral payments remained largely an untold secret. Only a handful of people truly knew or strongly suspected the full truth. Charlie Hodge, now an elderly man, carried the secret with him, a testament to his unwavering loyalty to his friend and boss. He rarely spoke of it, cherishing it as a private testament to Elvis's true heart. Arthur Henderson eventually passed away, peacefully, taking his theories to his grave, but not before subtly passing the baton of suspicion to his son. David, now an experienced funeral director himself, had no doubt. He had seen the pattern, received the calls, processed the payments. Timing of the cessation of the payments, coinciding roughly with Elvis's declining health and eventual death, solidified his belief. He too kept the secret, respecting the quiet wishes of the Memphis Angel. Kindness, especially profound kindness, these ripples that expand beyond the immediate beneficiaries. In the early 2000s, a young historian, Dr. Elena Ramirez, was researching social safety nets and charity in mid-20th century Memphis. She spent hours sifting through old newspaper archives, city records, and even some digitized funeral home ledgers. She kept encountering strange anomalies, records of funerals for indigent individuals or those with no discernible next of kin where the client paid line was marked anonymous benefactor, with payment amounts that far exceeded the norm for such cases. She noticed the consistency of these entries, the particular type of cases chosen, and the specific time period, roughly the mid-60s through the mid-70s. It wasn't organized charity. It felt more like a single, incredibly generous individual. She found some of Brenda Jenkins's old unpublished notes about the Memphis Angel, dismissed by her former editors. Elena was intrigued. One afternoon, in a dusty archive, she found a cryptic note from an old funeral home employee's journal. It spoke of a gentleman named Charlie who always called on behalf of the quiet donor and mentioned a fleeting glimpse of a very distinctive black car near one of the funeral homes after a particular high-profile pauper's burial. She was looking for a forgotten local industrialist, a philanthropist, but the distinctive black car and gentleman named Charlie clicked. The king, after all, was known for his Etruscan Cadillacs and his loyal entourage, many named Charlie. It seemed too wild to be true. Yet the pieces began to fit: the dates, the city, the immense wealth, the known generosity, the deep personal connection to loss, his mother, the need for absolute privacy in a life lived under constant public scrutiny. She never found irrefutable proof, no signed checks from Elvis himself, no direct statements. The anonymity was too meticulously protected, but the circumstantial evidence became. She started to believe that the legend of the Memphis Angel was, in fact, one of the most profound yet hidden aspects of Elvis Presley's legacy. She never published her findings explicitly, linking Elvis. She understood the sanctity of the secret, the profound intention behind the anonymity. Instead, in her academic papers and lectures, she spoke of the enduring power of unseen benevolence in Memphis history, subtly highlighting how compassion could flow from unexpected sources, leaving a silent but powerful mark on a community. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, Marcus Dixon, the architect whose father's funeral Elvis had paid for now in his 60s, was running his Dignity Fund with quiet dedication. He didn't know who had helped his family, but the spirit of that anonymous kindness lived on through his work. Sarah Jenkins, the school principal, had retired, but her Dignity Fund continued to assist families in need, a living monument to an unknown act of grace. The echo of Elvis Presley's quiet compassion vibrated through Memphis, not in headlines or monuments, but in the countless lives he had touched. It was in the serene expression on a grieving widow's face, the sense of peace for a child saying goodbye, the quiet gratitude of a community witnessing an unexplainable act of kindness. His greatest acts of charity weren't the flashy gifts of cars or money. They were the dignified burials he provided for strangers, the quiet compassion he extended to the forgotten and the vulnerable, all performed in the deepest anonymity. The true measure of the man, Elvis Presley, wasn't just the king of rock and roll, but also the silent guardian angel of Memphis, ensuring that even in death, every soul found a measure of grace. And that, in the quiet heart of a bustling city, was a legacy more enduring than any song